Except now, my idea of a threat isn't a bear, but not getting enough likes on my Instagram post, or obsessing over a pimple that threatens my self-image. So our definition of danger has changed, but we still approach that new definition, the pimple, with the same intensity and fear as we did the bear. So now my 16-year-old self is having a severe emotional response to a pimple, because she believes that if she doesn't fulfill a certain image or standard by society, she won't get accepted into society, and thus her survival is threatened. Hey guys, it's Sarah and welcome back to my channel. The information I will be providing you guys today will transform your understanding of ego, but more importantly, it will transform your relationship with ego. Because here's the thing, the ego isn't going anywhere. You cannot get rid of it. And although your experience of the ego will change throughout your entire life, the sooner you know this information, the sooner that you have these wider, higher perspectives of the ego, the sooner you're able to transcend it and thus develop a more healthy, positive relationship with it. Not even positive, because we're over that duality now, but just develop a healthy and more peaceful and harmonious relationship with the ego. So after this video, I guarantee you that that perspective will have really broadened to the point where you can actually develop, dare I say, an element of respect and appreciation for your ego. Once you understand truly its role in the human existence, you can work with it. And that is literally the entire point of spiritual growth, right? It's just taking any darkness, any shit that you have, and making it work for you. The ego is something that is so widely spoken about and so commonly referred to in our society, in our common language. With that frequent use of the word ego comes the potential for a lot of misconceptions. I found myself on the spiritual journey trying to observe my ego simply based on a preconceived idea I had of it, which was very vague and never truly defined for myself, and that is where I found myself hitting so many walls and so many roadblocks, because I was almost looking for this little box that I thought the ego was. And that's the thing about the ego, it's so tricky in and of itself, just like the nature of the ego is. You think that the ego is this one fixed thing, right? You think that the ego, oftentimes it's perceived as a superiority complex. You think that you are the best in the room, you are inflated, you're that person. And while that's definitely one truth within the ego, you guys, is so much more complex, aka tricky and shape-shifting and slippery than that. In this video, I'm going to be giving you a very comprehensive and very wholesome understanding of what the ego is from many different perspectives. The psychology perspective, we have the spiritual perspective, and we have the experiential perspective. And what I mean by that is simply understanding how the ego operates and what it is through the lens of actually trying to transcend it. And it's so different too from the more theoretical understanding of it, right? It's one thing to know something and know the path that you're walking, and it's a very different thing to walk the path you're walking. Also going to be going over the function of the ego. Once again, I feel like there is a huge misconception in our world. People are saying that the ego is the enemy. The ego needs to be starved and killed off in order for you to obtain spiritual enlightenment, in order for you to be spiritual. And if there's one thing I have learned in my spiritual journey, is that that is very far from the truth, and that is actually another ego trap, if not the biggest one there is, in my opinion. To experience your own ego and to observe and learn about your own ego as you are walking the path to enlightenment. And I say that very lightly because to think that enlightenment is something that is separate from you is a big trap in and of itself. But that being said, the process of enlightenment and healing and growth is a process that must be honored at the same time. So yeah, I'm just really excited, and let's get into it. So you guys know the drill. I have my water, and this is a whole freaking liter of some water. And I recommend that you guys do the same. I was gonna make myself a cup of tea, but it is the middle of August right now, so I'm gonna skip that. But either way, I just recommend you guys get cozy, get comfortable, maybe grab a notebook or your notepad, because hopefully I'm gonna be spitting some truth for you guys that will resonate with you, that will stick with you. And a big thing I do wanna say is that And this goes for honestly life in general, any content consumption in general. Whenever you find something that really sticks with you, something that resonates with you, always make a note of that, right? Because ultimately I am only like a reflection, and I purposely like to spit out a bunch of knowledge at you guys just so that you can really pick out what works for you. And that's another thing, whatever resonates with you, any lines, sentences, ideas, mantras that even come up to you, make a note of that, because that right there is something that resonates with your energy, with your soul, that will help you further on your journey. So I just want to let you guys know to do that, the water, the notepad, and get cozy. Let's get into this. Oh, and open your minds, open your hearts, because this is such a beautiful, beautiful space to be in, truly. So yeah, I love you guys. Okay, so there are many different perspectives in spirituality and psychology and the general language of the world and society of what the ego is. And first, I just want to explain the general idea. The ego is your sense of self. It is the identity that you have. And in order to do that, the ego separates you from society and the others. Through this separation, that an identity is formed. And this identity is really an accumulation of the thoughts, beliefs, and experiences that you've had over the entire course of your life, but especially that in childhood and your early childhood experiences. As we know, as I mentioned a lot on my channel, early childhood experiences are at the very core of many issues and wounds, and truly just development of our psyche in general, and that makes sense, right? So the ego is the person that you think you are. So as you're watching this video, I'm going to ask you, who do you think you are? And I'm sure that like a set of image, a set of beliefs, or an image of the person that you kind of think you are, the person you think that you are seen as by society and others, popped up into your head. So the sense of self comes with a set of boundaries as to what is you and what isn't you. So something that I want to point out is the ego really is a structure that exists within every single human being, but the content of the structure changes with everyone, which makes sense, right? Because we are all born in different cultures, in different upbringings, different family dynamics, with varying set of beliefs and rules and perceptions of the world. So although the structure is similar and consistent throughout individuals, more or less, the content of the ego differs between each person. So it is a construct or framework and almost a filter through which we define ourselves. And as a result, we define the rest of society and others. And it's also how we relate to the world. For example, if you had an experience as a kid where you were labeled awkward, whether someone in your kindergarten called you awkward, or you were talking to your first crush and they called you awkward, then it is likely that you took on this belief about yourself based on an interaction and an experience you had with the external world. And it is also likely that you have held on to this belief consciously or unconsciously to this day. And the crazy thing is that you may not even remember the experience that made you believe it, but the experience also tends to come with an emotion. So in this experience, it could have been shame, or in this example, it could have been shame, and you may not have resolved or processed and instead suppressed or repressed that shameful emotion. So although you don't actually remember the memory that caused it, you still have that feeling of mild or severe shame in similar circumstances, or whenever it is when you feel you are presenting or have to present or could potentially present an authentic version of yourself. Right? There's now that association of shame with vulnerability based on early childhood experiences. Now what's interesting is that you probably don't even remember the memory and the experience that had created this association. But thankfully, you remember the conclusion that you made about it, which is that you're awkward every time you're alone with someone in the elevator. So I keep stressing the word beliefs, because the ego is very fixed when it comes to beliefs, in that it makes conclusions about itself and the rest of the world and how it relates to the world, how it's capable and should and cannot relate to the world very early on in life. And then it's very fixed, because then the ego, it's a structure, right? It kind of becomes a framework through which you unconsciously experience the world and yourself for the rest of your life, unless you awaken to that cycle, hence this channel. So to wrap up this point, the ego is really anything to do with I, the individual, And whether this is taking things personally, feeling worthy, feeling unworthy, or holding beliefs like, I'm not the kind of person that does that, or, oh, you know, like, this is who I am, like, I can't help it. This is me, right? It's like, okay, like you're almost referring to this, it's almost like you projected, right? The person who's saying, I am not the kind of person that does that. It's like, well, you just said that, right? So that right there, that statement kind of allows you to become the kind of person that you think you're not capable of becoming. But now we're getting deep, and let's just keep going into this video because I have so much more for you guys. Now we're going to talk about the function of the ego. Contrary to popular belief, the ego isn't actually bad, and it's not good. It's neutral. It's a part of our psyche. Just a disclaimer, I am not throwing any shade towards that book. It's actually a really good one that I do recommend. However, I am always wary of using language such as enemy or fighting the ego, resisting the ego, because as we all know, what you resist persists. In order to gain an understanding of why we need an ego, it's important to look at humans as a species, because the ego is a structure that we have evolved with. And so based on the theory of natural selection, there must be a reason why we still have this structure. There must be some benefit in terms of species survival to having an ego and having a sense of self, as awkward as those elevator moments may be. So the ego's main job is making sure that we survive as an individual by meeting our basic survival needs, like avoidance of danger and dangerous situations, finding food, shelter, water, and finding a mate to reproduce with. So how does the ego do this, you ask? The ego is a very detailed and complex database and memory system that allows us to collect and remember and store our memories and experiences. So for example, it helped our ancestors remember their surroundings and where to find food, what situations are dangerous, what animals are threatening, remember where the heck our shelter is. The ego allows us to compartmentalize our life. We can block out certain memories, painful experiences, and traumas from our conscious self, and our ability to block out those recent traumatic experiences allows us to continue living in that same environment without the pain of those recent memories affecting our ability to do so. The ego also allows us to make comparisons, which requires an I as a basis for comparison and allows us to distinguish what it is we're interested in. By being able to distinguish our needs and desires, we are able to make decisions in favor of our survival. And the ego is all about survival. So this evolutionary perspective really allows us to develop an appreciation for the ego, knowing how these functions were critical for meeting our survival needs and allowing us to evolve and advance into the species that we are now. So you're probably getting the point now that the role of the ego is to make sure we survive. But if you haven't noticed, the need for survival now is very different than from when we just branched off as a species. In many parts of our world, the standard of living is so advanced that there is no true threat or need for such a strong fight-or-flight response the way that our ancestors needed when they were foraging for food and could get eaten by a bear at any moment. In the present day, we still have this ego that allows us this fight-or-flight response, but the severity of danger that most of us face is unequal to the degree to which we can protect ourselves.
Chad, he don't got nothing on you, yeah. Think don't sneak him? Nah, rush him, Chad.
So now we start to see this gap between our ability to handle danger, which is awesome, versus the actual danger that we experience on a daily basis, which is minimal. What's even more interesting is that our ego has not gotten the memo that our survival needs have changed. And our ego is still out here doing its job very thoroughly to scan and identify any potential threats in our environment. Now this could be a good thing, right? It's nice knowing that you are able to handle yourself in dangerous situations if anything ever does come up. Except now, my idea of a threat isn't a bear, but not getting enough likes on my Instagram post, or obsessing over a pimple that threatens my self-image. So our definition of danger has changed, but we still approach that new definition, the pimple, with the same intensity and fear as we did the bear. So now my 16-year-old self is having a severe emotional response to a pimple because she believes that if she doesn't fulfill a certain image or standard by society, she won't get accepted into society, and thus her survival is threatened. Where did she develop the idea that a pimple is a threat? Through social media, social conditioning, television, marketing. It's funny how the world that we live in is seemingly more afraid of aging skin than we ever were of bears. What was once a threat to our physical survival is now a threat to our sense of self, our self-image, who we think we are, and who we want to be. We see new generations being born with an ego, with a new standard of safety, which is much, much different from what humans actually need to survive. Because the need to protect your self-image is a very different life than the need to protect your physical self from harm. We now see generations obsessing over their appearance and one impossible standard of beauty, believing we are worthy or unworthy, feeling ashamed for not having the newest iPhone or pair of sneakers, all based on the ego doing its job to keep us safe. Safety now means social acceptance, not being judged, fitting in, or appearing in a particular way that society has deemed favorable. All of these mental constructs that help us avoid danger, except the new danger is shame, judgment, and imagined social exile. The consequences of this ego programming, in my opinion, high anxiety, depression, insecurities, and an obsession with self-image and being perceived in a certain way. Okay, so that was a very general and broad understanding of the ego and its role in human survival and kind of how it has developed and arguably warped with humanity with, the advancement of society and technologies in certain parts of the world. And I also just want to make it very clear, I am very, very, very aware of the need for such instincts and survival fight or flight modes and responses in many areas of the world that are not as developed as other areas. So I just want to make that very clear that whenever I am referring to places in the world that are privileged enough not to even need an ego, or to privileged enough to have an ego in overdrive without necessarily the original use of it, I fully recognize that that is not consistent throughout all of humanity. Very, very unfortunately, and hopefully that will change very soon. So now I'm going to talk to you guys about ego through the framework of psychology. And psychology is definitely more structured and theoretical, I would say, than perhaps the other things I'm going to be talking about, but I really wanted to give you guys this perspective because it is still so critical and central to the entire topic of the ego in general. So in psychology, the ego is a structure in the mind, amongst others, and actually has a very specific role and purpose in that psyche, in relation to the other parts and how they all kind of interact together. So this is really based on a Freudian principle, which goes on the id, ego, and superego being the three main structures of someone's psyche. So the ego is actually a manager that balances the other structures of the mind, which are the id and the superego. So I'm going to explain id first. Now the id is, at the very core, it is impulsive. So it is very unconscious and blind in the sense that it is based on the pleasure principle. So it kind of just wants what it wants. It just wants to take and feel things and feel good, feel pleasure with absolutely no regards for anything or anyone else. And I say blind and unconscious because it is not able to really acknowledge or consider anything outside of what it directly wants. So a good way to describe this or see it is like a baby screaming for something that it really wants. It needs its needs met, and it needs them met now, and it doesn't really care or cannot possibly fathom anything outside of that, right? So you're also probably thinking of like someone having a tantrum, a child having a tantrum when it doesn't get a toy or when it can't have something sweet before dinner. Now on the other side of the spectrum, we have the superego. And at the very core, the superego is very idealistic and judgmental. It is based on the morality principle, where it has a very specific set of beliefs and rules as to how it should behave in the world, and these are usually passed down from the same-sex parent, and based on that it creates this set of internal morals that are its guiding principles, or just the superego itself. And it really helps us have self-control based on what we think, aka what we were told was right. So now you can understand why the ego had to come in. Because we're having this id who is so ready to have a tantrum when it doesn't get what it wants, and we also have this almost high horse superego that is very focused and prioritizes being a good person, which obviously differs for everyone because the environments that we were raised in, what we were told, the social cues that we picked up on that are, indicate what we should do, what we can do, what is allowed and what is rewarded in society, in the world, is the superego. If we didn't have the ego to manage these different parts of us, we would just have these simultaneous desires for pleasure and a desire to be a good person. And I don't think I have to say that these two desires are obviously, potentially very conflicting. So the ego comes in and tries to balance these different parts of us that want very different things. The ego balances the id and the superego in order to fit into society. So at the very core, the ego is realistic. And it really tries to balance the id and the superego in order for the individual to behave in society and to exist in accordance with society and its rules. So ego in the psychological perspective really is the grown-up, actually. Ego really allows us to take into consideration our desires, our impulses, while still acting and expressing ourselves and behaving in a way that is aligned with our morals and what we think is right, according to the superego. So according to Freud, the ego is the most rational part of the mind that makes decisions that are the most realistic. And once again, you're starting to sense there, not only is there this idea of separation, which is consistent throughout all definitions of the ego, but in this sense, it's a lot more survival based, and I think it makes a lot more sense because when you understand the two potentially often opposing parts of the psyche, the ego is just like, y'all, I'm just trying to fit in. I'm just trying to survive here, but I want all these things. It's like the ego is the manager, but the translator, if you will, or the balancer between what really goes on deep in the mind, in the psyche, because the id and the superego are often very unconscious or subconscious, whereas the ego tends to be floating a little bit more towards the top, a lot more towards the top actually. So the ego kind of separates the dark, deep stuff and the external world, right? So the ego is very familiar with the rules of society, whereas the superego is just like, this is who I should be, and the id is like, this is what I want, and the ego is like, okay, I'm going to try to make this work as I interact with my external environment and try to make a name for myself, achieve my goals, be this person that I kind of want to be, right? But once again, it's all very blended and warped because the subconscious and the unconscious are so influential, especially to the ego. And sometimes the ego can be kind of a little bit weaker, right? Sometimes the desires of the other parts, like the id and the superego, the morals and the impulses, could be a lot stronger and even like meaner than the ego itself. And that is where we often experience a lot of mental disharmony and disbalance and mental challenges. So I really wanted to talk about the ego from this perspective because it really it definitely showed me that the ego is so not bad and it's so not good either. And it really helped me appreciate the role that it plays, especially after I learned the other structures that exist. Because the ego is a part of the mind just as much as the id and the superego. But in society, in conversation, people are not like, oh my God, like, look at them letting their id control them. Or like, oh, who does that guy think he is? His superego is off the top. It's like, you don't hear those things, right? You just hear ego, ego, ego. So I personally love this understanding, and I hope that you guys do too, because it really helps you open up your consciousness to the other areas of your consciousness. Hey guys, so now we're getting into my favorite part. Actually, no, this is going to be my second favorite. Now I'm going to be talking about the spiritual perspective and just how ego is actually referred to and approached in the spiritual community on the path of enlightenment, spiritual growth, raising your consciousness, all that stuff. So in the spiritual perspective, I would say there are two main things that really stand out to me that are unique in this perspective that are not as really widely discussed in any other facet of society or topics, and that is the false self. So in spirituality, the ego is primarily seen as the false self. It's who you think you are. This perspective is very unique because in order to understand what the false self is, or even the spiritual community claims that the ego is the false self, well then the next question is, what's the true self? The true self is pure consciousness. So we are all pure consciousness at our very core. And that is kind of what the path of enlightenment is all about. It's just shedding layers and illusions and false realities and ideas and perceptions of yourself and the world until you realize that there really is only one truth of who you are. So in my spiritual journey, I have shed so many layers of who I thought I was, and to be honest, that actually is what allows me to be in front of this camera right now. There were versions of myself that never would have let me be here talking to you because I was attached to certain perceptions of who I was and certain like false selves, right? The layers and the shedding of the false self is so deep and unraveling. So I still have work to do and ways to go. But that being said, the very like an onion, the very kind of top layers of myself believed that I was unworthy and I wasn't capable of certain things, and just other negative beliefs about myself. As I shed those illusions, aka as they were like kind of smacking me in my face, I was able to see the truth of what they were. And the truth is their own falseness, right? Seeing my own inauthenticity allowed me to see my authenticity. But seeing who I wasn't showed me who I was. And that's why the spiritual community refers so frequently to the false self and the limiting beliefs, because many of us, and if not most of us, are living our lives unconsciously. I know I definitely was. I was living thinking that I am one particular person, like literally being identified and attached to my ego and that set of accumulated beliefs that I had collected over time through experiences, interactions, collecting shame and guilt, and also collecting like superiority in certain aspects, collecting inferiority in certain aspects. And over time, you start to think that you are a certain person. And that's the false self, right? Walking around, talking to people, thinking, believing, going to sleep, thinking that we are this like image in our head. There's no separation between our awareness and the image that we have of who we are. So in my spiritual journey, what has been so transformative and so destructive was seeing how I wasn't who I thought I was, seeing the rules that I had for myself and what I was capable of and what I wasn't. And it's almost like when you learn how to let go of ideas and perceptions and beliefs of who you think you are, and you're able to observe your mind try to define you in any way, that is when you're able to fully come to the truth of who you are. But once again, you're only really able to do that by witnessing the falseness. Like I said before, most of us, I definitely was living like I was living like 19 years of my life believing that I was every thought that passed by me. I would experience sadness and shame and guilt. And that happens when you and your consciousness, you're not able to observe the thoughts because you are every single thought that passes by you. So it's almost like every time my mind and my emotions ran and I had an emotional or a thought reaction to something, I would go through that entire mental and emotional journey with each and every thought and emotion that I experienced. And that is literally unconsciousness. That is you being identified with, believing that you are that false self. The ego is almost like this I persona in your head, and it literally, even to this day, sometimes I'm listening to it and I'm just like, okay, is that who you think you are, ego? Like my ego will, I'm brushing my teeth, I'm just like, oh my god, I shouldn't have done that. Oh my gosh, like I shouldn't have done that. Like I'm ashamed because I didn't do enough today. Or like, oh, I'm too tired to do this. I'm too lazy to do that. I'm not worthy to do that. And it's interesting because it's like, who's the I? It's a structure in the mind that keeps referring to itself as the I. But for 19 years of my life, I did not have the awareness to watch this false self, this false I or little I, you know, run and refer to itself and just continue this constant narrative. But now, after years of dedication to my spiritual path and spiritual growth and my own deep, deep, deep healing, I'm able to brush my teeth and listen to this and listen to it and not be it. And sometimes, you know, I do get identified with it and I will fall into that hole of that like ego trap where it's like, okay, I'm fishing and now I think I'm the fish. And I'm just like running around with the fish is going crazy, and I'm going crazy too because I don't realize that I'm the one holding the rod. I don't realize that there is a rod and there's someone and a fish. So that still sometimes happens, but you know, I have gotten to the point, thankfully, through so much meditation as well, and things that I'm going to be sharing with you and I have shared with you on this channel that I'm really excited and honored to share with you. Things that have allowed me to create space and distance between that constant narrative of like the me. Because it's like, I'll be brushing my teeth now and it's like, okay, like, interesting. I was like, sometimes I'll even like respond to my ego. Don't be like, okay, is that who you think you are? That's not me. And that is literally the false self. It's the I that refers to itself, and you're sometimes able to watch it. So to really drive this point home, and I hope I'm doing a good job at it, the false self, and its awareness, the ego, really helps you see who you really are because it provides a contrast. So you're actually able to see that there is this ego that keeps talking and won't stop talking about itself, worrying about others. But the key is that you recognize that you are the one watching all this crazy shit go down in your head, for lack of a better word. And it's fascinating too because, and this is like honestly my favorite part of the spiritual path and the spiritual journey, is that it is so central around truth and the destruction of illusion. So that is it for today's video. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it, and I found it really interesting and even really insightful for myself to kind of just talk about it and put all of these different perspectives together. And it just reinforced my appreciation for the ego, and also it kind of takes the ego off of the pedestal, right? It's not the enemy, not the bad guy, and it's like, okay, you know what? It's just trying. The ego's trying. And sometimes it tries really hard and it can be frustrating, but at the end of the day, when you're able to see it for what it really is, you're able to free yourself from any judgments that the ego has made on what the ego is. And once again, just take yourself out of that ego loop and out of that ego trap, which will always be an option, right? So it's nice knowing that it's also always an option to step out of it. Let me know in the comments below what you guys thought of this video, and if anything really resonated or helped you see things from a different perspective. I would really just love to hear what you thought and what you felt. And if you like this video, be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel, where I really talk about and dive into all things healing and spiritual growth and stepping into and embodying and allowing yourself the version of yourself that you've always wanted to be, aka the version of yourself that you know you truly are. And if you're interested in what life is like having applied these concepts in lifestyle videos with me, including cooking and fitness and yoga and vlogging and just flowing on this spiritual path with me, I invite you to check out and subscribe to my channel Life with Sarah, where I focus on and show all of those things as well. Because, you know, it's really one thing to understand the path, to know the path, and it's a whole other thing to walk it. And I feel like it's only fair to show both to you guys and bring you guys along with me as I manage both. I love you guys so much, and that is it for today's video. I will see you at the next one.